want to start off with the inner membrane of the mitochondria. And so what we're going to do with this is start a new project. Here I'm doing it in Blender 3.5, and I'm going to import a mesh circle. And there are two ways that you can approach this for the inner membrane. You can either go in and edit and subdivide that a couple of times, and then just manually like change where the splines are, or you can do what I did here and delete the entire thing within edit mode, and then using the tool to draw out the mesh, you can just draw it out, but ensure that it's a complete shape at the very end, and you can connect unconnected vertices by selecting both of them with the shift key and then pressing F. And I'm going to import a plane and head on over to the geometry nodes tab, making sure to add in a new geometry nodes modifier and name it accordingly. So we don't actually need the geometry of the plane, so you can like just disconnect the group input from the group output and then insert a curve line into that group output geometry. And then add in a resample curve node right in between the curve line and output, and connect the count node over to the group input so that we can adjust that value later. Make sure to rename it appropriately so that in the future you can go ahead and realize what that is and adjust it as needed. And I kind of wanted to explain a little bit of my process here. I wanted to reconceptualize the inner membrane of a mitochondria kind of like as a really weird looking tube. So this mesh line is going to dictate the height of our inner membrane / mitochondria as a whole. And then this outer curve point that you see over here is like the profile curve of our tube here per se. So each of those individual points where the slope changes is going to be the amount of points that are on our curve, which is what the resample curve count point is for. It's to give us the ability to change the resolution of the mitochondria. So add in a curve to mesh node in between the resample curve and the output, and then drag down the Bezier circle from the first step over down into our geometry node setup and connect that to be the profile of our curve here. So we're partway there. We're getting there. We've got the basic part of this tube going on, but we want to be able to change the radius of our mitochondria as it goes upwards. So how can we change the R value of this tube here? We can certainly change the size of it, and we can certainly change the general radius of the entire thing, but what we want is to be able to change it as the basic index of the curve increases. And a way that we can do that is through the spline parameter node. So connect over that top factor node over to the multiply math node and connect that over to set radius. To control everything in the group input, connect that bottom multiply value over to the group input, and then to adjust it from this conical shape to the more like rounded U shape, add in a square root math node in between the multiply and the set curve radius. And to just further emphasize that shape, add in another square root. And you've got yourself a nice rounded little guy. You can add in another square root node if you so wish. I don't personally like how this looks for the inner membrane, but you can certainly do whatever you want. And we can change this group input value to the multiply in order to adjust like how large the radius is overall, while still maintaining that U shape. And to give it some volume, you can extrude the mesh, and it looks horrible when you initially do it, but that's because you need to uncheck the individual check mark and then reduce the offset by like a lot. I do -0.05 because that works for me. And it still looks a little funky, so add in a set shade node and uncheck shade smooth so you get it more like a sharp and less wonky looking shape. And to add on a material, just set material at the very end, create a new material in the material tab over on the right hand side, and be sure you label it appropriately. You don't really need to do any fancy material work here. This is just to like just set it for the future part of this tutorial. And always be sure to name your objects within your collection. So if you need to select a particular one, you can go and do that easily without having to go on a wild hunt to find the particular object you want. Now this is just a me thing, but I like to group everything up into like a really large frame in order to make this a bit more visually organized. So in addition to creating a frame around this group that is related to this intermembrane, we're going to add in a label and add in a color to the background of the frame so that when you first look at the entire setup at the very end of the project, it's very easy to distinguish one group of nodes related to a structure versus another. And I'm sure I don't have to tell anybody twice, but ensure that you save your work because anything can happen and Murphy's Law exists. So for this next part, unfortunately, my original footage got deleted, so you're gonna have to deal with just this overview of the outer membrane final layout. Yeah, we're going to begin with distributing a bunch of points over the top of the intermembrane outline that we just created. And the star of the show here is convex hull. So just to kind of like give an example of what it does, here is the distributed points on the surface, and then convex hull will like create a 3D shape that will encapsulate all of the different points that have been distributed. And so just to clean this up a bit and to have control over it in the side panel, connect over the like amount of points to distribute over to the group input node, and then change that value to like a higher number so that we can have a more like higher resolution. And the basic premise of everything else, if you want to pause and just look through, is changing and transforming the size of the original like outer membrane shape and then adding a boolean of the exact same thing within it, and then slicing it with a mesh cube that we don't like actually see within the scene setting, but it's just there to like cut the top and bottom of it so that it's taller or shorter. And this demonstration is just to further reiterate that the imaginary cube that we have here that's indicated with the arrow is the object in which we're going to use to slice the outer membrane, and primarily we're using the Z value here. And just like with every other section, going to just label this entire frame, add a color so that it's visually distinct from the other sections, and then move on to our next section, which is the mitochondrial DNA and ribosomes. At this point, I'm going to move away from the entire thing that we've just made and focus on the mitochondria DNA right now. So we're going to add in a mesh circle, just like before, and then head on over to geometry nodes, add in a new modifier here, and name that accordingly over to like mito DNA or something similar to that. Add in a curve to mesh / mesh to curve before that because we just added in a mesh circle, silly me. And then into that profile curve section, we're just going to add in a very basic curve circle, reduce the radius by like a lot, and you can additionally reduce the resolution of that a lot since the general size of the mitochondrial DNA is going to be quite small, so we don't really need that much detail. Rather, we can exchange that amount of detail over to performance, especially for my poor computer. Yeah, at the time, my computer was pretty old, and it would have absolutely sucked to have to render everything if it was like super high quality in resolution, that is. So at this point, we don't really want this to just be a regular circle, so we'll add in a little bit of a noise texture, and as every other tutorial will tell you, add in a vector subtract to subtract 0.5 from that offset. And over time, we're going to animate this W value for a 4D noise texture in order to change the general shape of the mitochondrial DNA. And that's basically it, other than just adding a material at the very end. And when you eventually want to like change the W value, or if you want to change the scale, detail, roughness, or distortion, just to adjust the general look, like that's basically it. Can add a subdivide mesh previous to the set position node in order to give it like a more noodly look, to avoid that jagged kind of that jagged appearance that is created with like a low resolution circle. And just because like this is such an easy thing to animate, I'm doing that right now, adding in a scene time node, a divide node, so that I can control how quickly, or rather how slow, this is going to change over time. And then add in a add node, which will effectively kind of be like just changing the W node, because we're going to duplicate this entire setup a couple of times, and if all of the values are exactly the same, we're going to get the exact same changes in the position over time. Now what I'm doing right now is creating a new collection of mitochondrial DNA, placing that previous DNA that we've just created into it, and then duplicating that like a bunch of different times. And what you're going to want to do with each of these is select like the fake user button. I don't understand it completely, but it makes it so that like you don't change every single like object that's associated with that immediately, and just change the noise seed value that I've created beforehand. And here we have a wiggly little guy, a bunch of wiggly little guys. We don't need to see them right now per se. We just need to have that in our repertoire of mitochondrial DNA to work with later. At this point, I'm going to move on into just distributing a bunch of stuff into the volume of our mitochondria. That will include our mitochondrial DNA, and that will include ribosomes, which are just simple enough. So here I'm going to add in a distribute points in volume node, which is such a fantastic node to add into Blender. Like, it takes so much work out of the entire process. I might have to update a previous tutorial because of that. And in lieu of that, add in an instance on points value, drag our collection in from before, and check the separate children and reset children value. In addition to that, you're going to want to check the pick instance value. I just haven't done it in this video quite yet. There you go. Oh no! Why can't I see my instances in here? Well, if you zoom out, and not in that viewport, but in the other one, you'll notice that there is a problem because the input geometry is not actually a volume, it is a mesh. That's something that I did wrong here. Don't make that mistake. Add in a mesh to volume node, and you'll see that it will actually work, that our instances are distributed finely into here. Now this is just for me. I'm putting my instances in a different location so I can just focus on my immediate object here. And I would highly suggest changing the scale of the DNA. You can do that either with a value node, or you can do that so that you can control it within the group input value, which I'll do in a second. Now, if you actually want to change things within the group input, just connect a empty node over to that scale value, and then you can adjust the size of the DNA from here. Now, there are a bunch of other parameters that you can adjust in order to like control how much DNA is within your volume. You can connect the group input value over to density, And I would also suggest connecting it to the exterior bandwidth, making sure to rename both of those nodes within the input group input value so that you know like what you're actually changing later on. You can make it a really freaking dense mitochondria if you want, like packed full of DNA. And you can also change how much that DNA will, like, for lack of a better word, spill outside of the volume with the exterior bandwidth. Now, if you're lazy like me and you don't want to have to change the X, Y, and Z uniformly, what you can do instead as an alternative is to connect a new node over to just a regular math node, divide, make sure that that's the top value, and then connect the resulting value over to scale so that you can change the value of the scale of the DNA just automatically and uniformly at the same time without having to make sure that you select the X, Y, and Z at the same time or go in and just manually type in the same number over and over again, just because I find that annoying. And I would suggest doing that from the beginning unless you want to, for some reason, like adjust just the X or the Y scale on your own. Now this setup is way too uniform. I don't want all of the DNA to look like it's just a floating stack of weird pancakes. I want the rotation to be different for each of these individual instances. So in order to achieve that, add in a rotate instances node, add in a random value node, and make sure that it's from like 0 to 360. And you can just like adjust how much everything rotates by adding in a vector math node. Now with the setup that we have currently, you can begin to animate the random rotation of each of these instances if you want to at this point. So add in a scene time node and connect that seconds over to the top of an add vector node and just kind of let it roll. My computer is playing this back extremely slowly because she's really old and it sucks. So I'm getting a new computer soon. Yay! But that's all you need to do to really animate this guy. Other than the other stuff that we did at the very beginning with changing the offset noise values, that's pretty good for what we have here for the mitochondrial DNA. So at this point, we can move on to the ribosomes after creating our group and frame layout here, labeling everything as needed. Just kind of repeat that entire process over again. So you can basically just repeat the entire process from before, adding in a mesh to volume node, and then a distribute points in volume node, connecting those together, and then an instances to points value at the very end. And the main difference here is that instead of connecting the mito DNA collection and then selecting from those instances, we're just going to instance on very basic points. And yeah, just add in a points node, connect that into the instances, and then connect the resulting output into the join geometry nodes. You don't see anything right now because the radius of the points is too small to be seen by our viewport. So just adjust that as need be. And similar to the mitochondrial DNA setup that we have before, just going to connect our group input over to the density and the exterior bandwidth as well, so that we can adjust how many ribosome instances are present in the volume here. And I'm just going to also do my typical setup for like having fine-tuned changes to the sizes of different objects. Adding in a math node, a 1, and then our value over to that bottom part. So when we divide that 1 over our input, we get a fraction of the size of the points that we wanted. As usual, label, 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 label. Label everything. Label literally everything because it makes life so much easier. Because I like took a break from this project for a while because I got married, ooh, and coming back to it and seeing most of my stuff that was labeled and like all organized nicely and neatly for me to come back to was such a treat. If I hadn't done that, I would probably still be working on this. So you'll thank yourself later. So this isn't really an exact science of what I'm doing here. I'm just kind of like futzing around with the values until something looks good, until it looks like I have an approximate good-ish ratio of ribosomes and DNA to volume here. But like, I do realize that this isn't like exactly a proportion to real life mitochondria. Uh, this is stylized, so everything that is featured here, obviously take it with a grain of salt visually. It's just more of like a very fun tutorial for maybe like educators or hobbyists like me that just kind of want to make fun science things that are very basic abstract approximations of the actual thing that we're trying to describe. So yeah, this is very much stylized. Take this all just as it is. Don't read too deep into it. It's just something very pretty that I wanted to try to make. At this point, we're at like one of my favorite parts of the entire process, which is creating materials and then just making this entire thing like look pretty. So at the end of each of our individual structures, add in a set material node and create a new material and label it appropriately. And then make sure that you go back into that set material node and then select the material that we've just created. These are all going to be placeholders for the more fancy materials that I want to like style for the final end product. So after navigating over to the shading tab, we're gonna just like put basic ass colors in here just to be able to distinguish very easily one element from another. And I'm not trying to make this look pretty right now. I'm not trying to put together a cohesive palette or anything. This is just solely for the purpose of being able to distinguish each of these individual elements from one another. And on that note, I'm going to add in an HDRI into the scene. I'll attach a link over to the Polyhaven assets, the add-on that I'm using here. I think I had to pay it for it. It's been a while since I purchased it, so I don't remember how much it cost, but it'll be in the links and resources below. Reduce the render amount to my final scene setting down like a lot so it doesn't take an eon for it to all render together. And yeah, here's our basic scene. I don't really like the high contrast studio, so I'm just gonna adjust that to something else, change the rotation a bit, and I believe I end up choosing a completely different HDRI, so hold on. Yeah, I think this is the one that I end up sticking with because it looks pretty good. adjust the rotation as I want. And yeah, here we have a very basic scene. If you really wanted to, you could probably just end it right here if you wanted. Just add in a camera, render that image right there and then, and you're good to go. But I wouldn't suggest it because this kind of was giving me Zoom vibes, if you know what I mean. And I'm not talking Zoom, the video calling thing. I'm talking Zoom like the 90s show that I watched when I was a kid. So I'll go back in at some point and make sure to change all the material settings. But at this point in time, I want to go back and fix up a couple of things. So right here, you see at the very bottom, there's a little bit of clipping from the inner membrane into the outer membrane. And you can adjust that by increasing the resolution or changing the seed value of like how those points are distributed on top of the surface. Adjusting the thickness of the outer membrane as needed. And yeah, just changing the resolution of that. I think that this is the most annoying part of the entire thing, is just taking a look around just to make sure that there is absolutely no clipping and no weird things going on that we can see from this viewport at least. Because the more resolution that you add, the lower the performance of your computer will output. And since my computer is kind of old, this slows it down considerably. Yeah. If you so wish, you can change the general resolution of the outer membrane as well by adding in a subdivision surface modifier in between the mesh boolean of the shape of the outer membrane and the bool cube there, and just increase or decrease the subdivisions as many times as you wish. At this point, I'm going to do a little bit of scene setup. So easy that I think anybody can do it in their sleep if they just practice it a couple of times. Add in a mesh circle, reduce the resolution by quite a bit. I reduced mine over to 6. Head on over to edit mode. Press F so that you can create a face, and then EZ to extrude upwards. And you got yourself a nice, cool little benzene boy. Just kidding, it's not a benzene, but you get what I'm trying to say. And I'm going to add in a modifier to bevel this guy up a bit, reducing the amount of which I'm beveling it, and then increasing the segments a little bit so it kind of gives it like a more of a round, natural shape. Because how often do you actually see sharp edges in real life? Not very. It's always kind of like a little bit rounded. So I'm going to change the perspective of my camera a little bit here, reduce the size of my hexagonal scene here, and then extrude upwards because I want it to kind of be like a really tall room, I suppose, and then remove a couple of the faces so that my camera can see the main focus here, of course. You check it out in cycles. Looks fine. Good enough. We can move on to the next part, which is shading the background and getting into the more itty-bitty gritty of our mitochondrial materials. So I'm going to start off with the volume because it's like extremely straightforward change the base color over to something that's kind of like an off-white, and then lower that alpha value by quite a bit, lower the roughness value and increase the clear coat, so it kind of gives it more of like a glassy without being glass look. And upon initial inspection, it's cool. So for the rest of the materials, I'm going to go over to Coolars because I'm a fan of the site, and if anybody associated with them wants to sponsor me, that would be awesome. Just kidding. I don't make enough views on this channel. And I'm going to just pick out a palette that I like and that I want to associate with my object so that I can kind of create like a cohesive aesthetic here. And I think that this palette looks pretty good. So as usual, I'm going to go over to the generator and then just double check to make sure that everything looks okay for those who may be colorblind. And there's a little bit of a problem with this one. In between that pink and that light green color, they kind of look similar for those who have protanopia. So to combat that, I'm just going to adjust the lightness / darkness of the color and call it good, because now it's going to be a bit more distinguishable for those who may have that condition. At this point, I'm not doing anything particularly fancy with each of the individual structures other than just adding in the hex value so I can compare and see how everything will look all together. Like, do I want the ribosomes to actually be like this pink color? Do I actually want the inner membrane to be this green color? I just kind of like switch it around until I find a combination that looks pretty good. And I would highly suggest like placing a decent amount of contrast in between elements here, so it makes it easier for the viewer to visually distinguish one element from another. You wouldn't want your ribosomes to be like the exact same color as the volume, otherwise it would kind of like, you know, blend into the background there. And you want to be able to distinguish each of the individual structures if you're trying to like teach this to other folks or to try to like display the inner workings of mitochondria to whoever your audience is. One way that you can distinguish each of these structures from one another is by varying like the surface properties other than just the color, like changing the roughness or the subsurface value or how metallic it is or what the clear coat value is going to be. There's a bunch of different ways that you can mask the amount of which like some attributes are shown. Like you can use the noise texture to vary the amount of roughness across the object, and the same thing goes for like with every other attribute. But here I'm trying to keep it as simple as possible because I don't want to overcomplicate things too much. If I so feel like it's necessary, or if I feel like, you know, exploring more material properties in the future for a particular structure or something, I'll go like more in depth about what variables you can change. But this is YouTube, and there's a hella bunch of YouTube tutorials that you can look at, so there's that. Here's one little tip that I picked up that was pretty cool. It's for randomly varying the color across a bunch of different instances that are all considered to be like one quote-unquote object. So here I'm adding in a color ramp and an object info node and connecting that random value over to the factor value and then the color over to the base color, so that each of the individual instances of the ribosomes vary across that color ramp that I have defined. I'm just going to render out the second draft version of my materials just to kind of get an idea of, do I like where all of these general colors are laying? Do I like what surface values I've created? And then make my adjustments from there. I do want to note that this isn't my final draft of the materials for each of the individual structures. Rather, I'm just kind of setting up my compositing tab. So after each individual frame for my animation is completed, then I can have a general idea of how it's going to turn out. So I'm just changing the contrast because my scene feels a little bit flat, changing the hue saturation values because it does feel a little bit too saturated. And then I'm adding in like a color overlay with a mix RGB node and setting that mix over to soft light because that's currently the color mixing thing that I'm favoring right now. I don't know. I go through phases when it comes to color mixing. So remember I said that that animating thing only worked in certain circumstances? Well, this is the circumstance it doesn't work in when you vary the volume. So for some reason, it like changes the like seed value in which you distribute the ribosomes and the DNA. So it gives it like a choppy look. So this is your best way to kind of get around it. So this is just a very basic visual overview of how you can animate it so that it's more friendly for changing the volume of the mitochondria. So if we go tab into this group that I have created, the basic premise of it is that you create a grid, and then within that mass amount of grids, you instance a bunch of mesh lines, delete a random amount of those, and then you instance on the points of that mesh line that you have created within the grid. And you vary the location of those points instanced over time such that they slowly descend over time, but also like move in X and Y and Z direction while also moving downwards. And then add a material at the very end. I really hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, I can just, do a really quick animated doodle off to the side. And the very same exact principle that is behind the ribosome animated that I just explained is also behind the mitochondrial DNA. I hope that it's kind of like at least a little bit clear that anything that really happens with the mitochondrial DNA is also applicable to the ribosome as well. The only thing is that the instances are different between the circular DNA and just the regular points that you can instance on each of the distributed points that you have created. And as per usual, the main driver for animating this entire thing is using a scene time node and connecting that seconds node over to whatever math node you want to use to control how quickly, how slowly, or what seed that you want to change it by, such that just you don't have to like add in any manual values. You can just let the animation play and it'll just automatically drive everything for you. So basically, when all is said and done, there's two separate like layouts that you can create. One is just like a regular mitochondria and ribosome still distribution that you can animate where the volume is going to stay exactly the same. And then the other one is a mitochondria, DNA, and ribosomes animation that you have to set up that's slightly different from the previous one, where it is friendly for if you reduce or increase the mitochondrial volume. And I'm not entirely sure why changing the volume will mess up the seeds and make it look a lot more choppy. I'm sure there's an underlying mechanism that I haven't quite looked into. But yeah, those are two different setups that you can create. And depending on whatever your needs are, you can switch between the two, or you can just ignore one. At this point, I'm working to just animate everything, including the reveal of the outer membrane into like slicing it so you can see within the inner membrane and the volume, and then lowering the volume of that inner membrane and just continuing onwards with that. Now, I don't know about you, but my outer membrane kind of feels a bit stale, so I'm going to add a bit of texture. And to do this, I'm just going to use a color ramp and a noise texture, connect that over to the base color so I can see what my texture is going to look like at the very end. And as always, this is going to be a 4D texture for me because I do want to animate how the bump of this texture will look over time. I'm going to add in a value node over to a math node so I can change the amount that this is going to change over time. Connect that over to a bump node and connect that over to the normal so that the texture of the material itself looks like it's bumpy, but if you take a closer look at the orange/yellow outline, like it's not actually bumpy. This is more of an illusory effect. And I'm just going to keep adding on and mixing that effect with different settings of the noise texture and using a mix RGB node to adjust how much the top value versus the bottom value is going to show through. And to make this a bit more complex, if you wanted to, you can change the mixing attributes. So like color dodge or darken or lighten or whatever just looks good for your scene. This isn't precise for me. This is just like me messing around and finding out what looks good. So yeah, just do what looks great for you. And as previously mentioned, I'm going to just change that value node over from the beginning of my animation over to the very end, such that the texture of the membrane looks like it's changing over time. If you want to be fancy, you can add in a depth of field effect here so that the camera will just focus on whatever your object is, that being the quote-unquote plane / mitochondria. And you can change the f-stop or the distance so that you kind of like get this really nice blurring effect on everything else except for anything that is within your frame of reference. And yeah, that's the premise of this entire part. Mitochondria and a little bit of animation and a little bit of the kind of rocky process that it took to get to this point. So I hope you can forgive me with the amount of time that it took for me to get between part 1 and part 2. And even at this point, I realize that there's a lot of additional work that can be done to make this look a bit more pretty and make the movements a bit more quote-unquote accurate. I had a suggestion from a Twitter user who said that there was like that it wasn't like noodly enough, that it needed like some fusion going on. And while I thought at the time that I was able to implement it using geometry nodes, I did attempt to try to do it and it didn't work out. So that is another feature that I would like to add in at some point. I don't know, maybe I'll follow up in a couple of months with a newer and better improved version of a procedural mitochondria. Who knows what'll happen in between Blender 3.4/3.5 to 3.8, or even, God forbid, 4.0, I can't imagine what the wonders of that Blender version will create. And even in the meantime, I'm like 100 billion% open to taking suggestions and critiques, because the better that I can refine this, or the better that the Blender science community can refine this, the better it is for the general populace, or whoever your audience may be, whether that is the general public or maybe students taking a high school course or college students. I don't know what this is going to be used for, if at all. But no matter what, I want it to be useful to at least one person out there. That would be cool. Yeah, so leave comments down there. That would be great.